July 1944. The war in the Pacific had reached a fevered rhythm of fire and exhaustion. In the gray fields outside Mukden, Manchuria, a shape lay broken in the mud, gleaming silver, even under the smoke-stained sky. Japanese soldiers surrounded it cautiously, rifles raised as if the thing could still breathe. What they saw was not a Zero, nor a B-17, nor anything they had ever encountered. It was enormous, its wings, wider than any hangar in the region, could hold its fuselage curved like the body of a ship. The air smelled of burnt oil and salt metal. To the men watching it looked less like an aircraft than a fallen star. By noon, word had reached Tokyo. The wreck was American, a new type of long-range bomber reported to have attacked Yawata just hours earlier. Japanese command understood immediately what it meant: a weapon that could reach the home islands from bases far beyond fighter range. They cabled Berlin that same evening. Within a week, a small team of German engineers boarded a transport plane bound for Manchuria. Among them was Hauptmann Erich Müller, an airframe specialist from the Junkers Works in Dessau. He had spent the last 2 years perfecting rivet spacing on Ju-88 bombers, until now the pride of the Reich's aviation corps. When the plane touched down in Mukden, he expected to see another Allied curiosity. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The wreck had been pulled onto a makeshift ramp. The nose cone was crushed, the tail sheared cleanly, but the main fuselage remained eerily intact. Even in ruin, the machine radiated precision. The skin panels, polished aluminum, fit together so tightly that Müller could barely insert a knife blade between the seams. The Japanese technicians had already begun cataloging parts, yet progress was slow. They lacked tools fine enough to remove certain bolts without damaging them. Müller knelt beside one of the engines, a Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, and traced his finger along the housing. It was unlike any radial he had ever studied. Immense cylinders, turbo-supercharger assemblies, thicker than a man's torso, wiring loomed in neat bundles and coated with a rubberized material, unfamiliar to him. He wrote one sentence in his notebook: "This is not a bomber, this is an ecosystem." The more they examined, the more impossible it became to explain. The aircraft was mostly aluminum, but not the brittle alloy the Luftwaffe used. The Japanese metallurgists suspected a heat-treated compound 75ST with tensile strength unmatched by any German supplier. Every inch of the fuselage seemed to mock them with its simplicity. The Americans had managed what German engineers had long dreamed of: continuous, unbroken panels shaped by massive hydraulic presses rather than patchwork plates. It was beauty born of machinery, not craftsmanship. Müller stood back, wiping his hands on his coat, and whispered, "They've built a bomber," as if it were a product, not a prototype. Inside the shattered cockpit, the smell of ozone and scorched insulation lingered. The Germans noted sealed joints, pressurized conduits, and a cockpit layout arranged for comfort as much as control. There were padded seats, thermal lining, even adjustable lighting. To Müller, it felt alien. "We are still building aircraft by hand," he muttered. "They are building them by civilization." He realized then that the Reich's faith in precision mechanics, its obsession with the artisan engineer, was obsolete. Here lay proof that America had moved beyond artistry into pure industrialization. Outside, the Manchurian wind carried dust across the field, catching in the fragments of the bomber's polished skin. The Japanese officers, proud but weary, looked to their German counterparts for answers. Müller said little. What could he say? The machine spoke for itself. Its presence in this remote corner of Asia was both a miracle and a warning. The Allies had built something that defied the logic of the Axis industrial world, a weapon too vast to be countered by brilliance alone. That evening, as floodlights bathed the wreck in pale glow, the technicians began their work in earnest. They mapped every curve, measured every rivet, photographed every angle. A crane lifted the wing sections onto wooden trestles where German and Japanese engineers argued quietly over measurements. One man compared the surface finish to that of a commercial automobile. Another disagreed. No, it's finer. This is the future of war, manufactured like a consumer good. Nearby, a soldier scraped away a handful of mud and found a plate stamped with a simple name, Boeing. For Miller, that word carried more terror than any bomb. Boeing was not a genius, not a hero, not a secret. It was a factory. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. The Allies had built not just machines, but systems that could replicate perfection thousands of times over. In Germany, a single bomber took weeks of labor by craftsmen. In America, an identical bomber rolled off the line every hour. The war, Miller thought, had already been decided not by battles, but by blueprints. He closed his notebook and watched the horizon darken over Manchuria. "They've reached a century we haven't even imagined yet," he said quietly. The others didn't answer. Somewhere beyond the hills, the low hum of another engine echoed one more B-29 heading toward a target that couldn't defend itself. If you believe the true battlefield of World War II was not in Europe or the Pacific, but inside the factories of America, comment 1. If you think victory still belonged to strategy, not steel, then press like. And don't forget to subscribe, because what they found next inside the wreck would make even the most loyal engineer question everything he believed about power. The wreck was no longer a mystery. It was an autopsy. For 3 days, the joint German-Japanese technical team dissected the silver giant piece by piece, working under the constant hum of generators and the smell of burned oil. The sun in Manchuria was merciless, but the engineers barely noticed. They were inside something that felt impossible, something that had no right to exist in 1944. The first thing they uncovered were the wings. Each section was a cathedral of aluminum ribbed spars and hydraulic lines so perfectly fitted that not a single screw appeared misaligned. A Japanese engineer ran his hand along the inside of the frame and said softly, "This was not built. It was printed by the gods." The German interpreter didn't translate that line. Miller, standing nearby, heard it anyway. At Junkers, every bomber was built from plates, each hammered, bent, and joined by hand. On the B-29, the Germans discovered a single continuous extrusion stretching from wing root to tip. The joints were invisible, the rivets sunk, flushed the panels cold and smooth as glass. They pried one open reluctantly and found layers of structural reinforcement that should have added weight, yet somehow the entire assembly felt lighter than the Heinkels. The alloy, they noted, was not ordinary duralumin. It was something else, heat-treated, age-hardened, a secret mixture that neither German nor Japanese metallurgy could reproduce. Then came the engines, 4 Wright R-3350 duplex cyclones, each one capable of 2,200 horsepower, fitted with twin turbo-superchargers. When the German engineers dismantled one of the turbos, they stared at it in silence. The machining was perfect. Every impeller blade gleamed like a mirror. No casting flaws, no imbalance. The housing was seamless. Miller took one measurement, then another. He compared it to the specs of the Daimler-Benz DB603, Germany's most advanced power plant. The American turbocharger operated at almost double the pressure, yet ran smoother. "They've mastered heat," he murmured. "We're still learning to control it." The Japanese officer beside him frowned. "Could we copy it?" Miller shook his head. "Even if we had the drawings, we lack the furnaces, the alloys, the patience. They are not building engines. They are building continuity." Inside the fuselage, the shocks multiplied. The internal layout was unlike any bomber they knew. It was organized not for pilots, but for efficiency. Each compartment was pressurized, connected by narrow tunnels that allowed the crew to move without oxygen masks. The Germans tested the seals airtight. The window glass was layered, resistant to shattering. A simple plaque read, "Cabin pressure maintained 8.6 psi at $30,000 feet." Miller stared at it, thinking of the Luftwaffe's desperate attempts to make their own pressurized cabins work. None had lasted longer than an hour in flight. The Americans had turned it into routine engineering. When they reached the cockpit, their notes slowed into silence. The controls were labeled with printed tags, not hand-stamped metal. The gauges glowed faintly from a regulated current. Even the wiring looked unreal, each cable neatly bound, color-coded, wrapped in plastic insulation instead of the brittle rubber Germany used. A Japanese technician cut one open and blinked. "It's not copper," he said. Miller examined the shining thread. "Silver alloy," he whispered. "They're wiring planes like laboratories." The gun turrets brought the next revelation. Each was remotely operated, controlled from the pressurized cabin through periscopic sights and electric servos. To the Germans, this was sorcery. They had imagined such systems in sketches, but here it was alive, tangible, reliable. Each turret carried twin 50-caliber Brownings linked to a central fire control computer. The word computer wasn't one they used yet, but the Americans had already built it in steel. That night they dined in the hangar, surrounded by pieces of the aircraft. The smell of machine oil mixed with the sweetness of canned American rations recovered from the wreck. One of the Japanese officers unwrapped a chocolate bar stamped with the Hershey's logo. He looked at it, then at the B-29's aluminum ribs, and laughed bitterly. They can feed their soldiers with sugar and still build this. Miller wrote furiously in his notebook. He drew diagrams, annotated alloy samples, listed every component by weight. By the second day, he stopped using exclamation marks. The astonishment had turned into resignation. "This machine," he wrote, "is not the product of a design office. It is the child of a civilization built for endless reproduction." The next morning, the team inspected the bomb bay doors. They opened with hydraulic precision, smooth and silent. The pistons were polished to a mirror sheen. "This is factory work," said Miller. "Identical tolerances every part. They don't just build one bomber, they build 1,000 exactly alike." The numbers haunted him. One B-29 required 2.5 million man-hours to assemble, yet the United States could produce 100 per month. That single fact reduced every German invention, every secret project to irrelevance. The Reich had been proud of its Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, its rockets, its submarines. But each of those wonders existed in handfuls. The Americans had achieved something far greater: consistency. When the inspection reached the landing gear, a Japanese engineer crouched and whistled. "It retracts hydraulically," he said. "We can do that." But when they examined the fluid reservoirs, they found filters finer than anything available in Axis factories. Even the hoses were labeled with printed maintenance schedules. Nothing had been left to improvisation. As night fell, the German engineers gathered in the command hut. The mood was heavy. Miller stood at the chalkboard covered with notes, sketches, and comparisons. He pointed to the top line, B-29 Superfortress, the industrial ideal. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we are not competing with an aircraft. We are competing with an ecosystem. They have factories that build factories. We cannot fight that with talent. We would need an entire world." No one argued. The Japanese colonel lit a cigarette and stared at the diagrams. "Then, we are already behind," Muller nodded. "By a century," he said, "maybe two." Outside, the wind swept across the empty airfield, carrying with it the faint echo of engines far above the sound of another B-29 passing overhead on its way to a new target. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Even as they studied the fallen giant, its siblings were multiplying beyond reach. If you believe the real weapon of America was not its bombs, but the factories that could replace them, overnight, comment 2. If you still think genius, not mass production, defines power, then press like. And subscribe, because what they would uncover next inside the wreck would make even the proudest engineer question what it truly means to be advanced. By the fourth day, the wreck no longer felt like a relic of war. It had become a cathedral of precision. Every panel, every wire, every sealed edge whispered of a logic that transcended battle. The German and Japanese engineers no longer spoke of copying it. They spoke of understanding it as one might study a civilization discovered beneath the ice. The next task was the cockpit. The Japanese mechanics had already cleared debris from the front fuselage and built a wooden platform to access the shattered glass dome. Miller climbed first, followed by Lieutenant Hasegawa, the youngest among them, who carried a notebook too clean for the place they were standing. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of burnt insulation and something faintly sweet hydraulic fluid mixed with plastic. The controls were bent but intact. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The space looked less like a cockpit and more like an office padded seats with adjustable frames armrests lined with fine stitching dials, arranged not by habit, but by ergonomics. The Americans had thought of comfort even at 30,000 feet. To Miller, who had flown in prototype bombers that froze the skin off one's face, it felt surreal. He tapped one of the cracked gauges with his pen. The label read, "Cabin pressure maintain 8.6 psi at altitude." The implication struck him like a hammer. The B-29 was not just designed to fly higher, it was designed for its crew to live there, sealed away from the war outside. "They've built an atmosphere," he muttered. The inspection continued. Hasegawa traced the edge of a rubber-sealed joint and found it unbroken despite the crash. He pressed it with his finger. It sprang back airtight. "Synthetic polymer," Miller said. "We'd need an entire chemical plant to make this much." He pointed to the ductwork above them, smooth curved aluminum tubes running through the fuselage. Each line carried filtered heated air from an environmental control system that the Axis hadn't even dreamed of implementing. On a clipboard recovered near the navigator's seat, they found a maintenance log written in pencil temperature readings, pressure adjustments, oxygen flow rates. The handwriting was neat, methodical, almost casual. The Americans had made climate control routine. For the Axis, it was a luxury reserved for submarines and research labs. One of the German engineers switched on a handheld light and followed the wiring beneath the dashboard. "Color-coded," he said. "Each system insulated, tagged, traced." Miller nodded. "In Berlin, we rely on memory. Here they rely on order." He ran his gloved fingers along the cables, smooth plastic, not the brittle rubber of German designs. The difference was more than material. It was mindset. Then they found the most stunning detail of all: a single glass dome, housing what appeared to be a gyroscopic autopilot connected to an early analog computer. The system used vacuum tubes and servo motors to maintain stability. It was not invention for invention's sake. It was discipline, mechanized. The Americans had transformed complexity into procedure. The Japanese officers outside grew restless. "We have learned enough," one of them said. Miller shook his head. "No. We've only seen what it does. We haven't seen why it works." He pointed to the seams along the interior bulkhead. This is manufacturing at its purest form. Every part fits every other. No adjustment, no tolerance stacking. They're building aircraft the way we build watches, only thousands of times larger. They took samples of insulation glass and aluminum skin, but it was the quiet details that broke their morale. On the back of the pilot's seat, someone found a small instruction plate engraved with maintenance notes: "Replace filter after 600 hours of operation." Miller stared at the line, realizing what it implied: these bombers were meant to last. Germany's bombers were built to survive missions. America's were built to survive wars. When dusk fell, they gathered their notes in silence. The heat of the day had faded, replaced by the dry hiss of wind through the hangar doors. Miller sat on a crate, his notebook open on his knees, sketching the curvature of the cockpit glass. "It's almost art," Hasegawa said. Miller closed his book. "No," he replied. "Art dies with the artist. This will not." He looked around at the others. Every man wore the same expression, a mix of awe and despair. They were engineers staring not at an enemy, but at an inevitable future. What they saw was not merely superiority, it was inevitability shaped in aluminum. Later that night, as they returned to their quarters, Hasegawa paused by the doorway. "Do you think we can ever build something like this?" he asked. Miller shook his head. "Perhaps, but not soon. This isn't about design or skill. It's about how they think. We build perfection one piece at a time. They build it in millions." Outside the airfield was silent, except for the faint echo of crickets. The wreck of the B-29 lay under a tarpaulin, its silver skin glinting under moonlight. To any passerby, it was a dead machine. To Miller, it was something alive, proof that America had discovered the next phase of civilization. He returned to his desk, lit a cigarette, and wrote a single line before closing his journal. "They have made comfort into a weapon." If you believe true superiority isn't just power, but the ability to make power effortless, comment 3. If you think war should never be that efficient, press like and subscribe, because what they would see next inside the factories that built this monster would show why the war had already been lost before a single bomb fell. The wreck in Manchuria lay silent under its tarp, but across the Pacific, its identical twin was being born, one of 100 that month. The sound of hammers and rivet guns rolled through the Kansas plains like distant thunder. Inside Boeing Plant No. 1 in Wichita, the air shimmered with heat and movement. Rows of assembly lines stretched farther than the eye could see, nearly 2 miles of mechanized choreography. A foreman's whistle cut through the clatter. Thousands of men and women moved in rhythm welders and denim overalls, women in kerchiefs guiding rivet heads into place, inspectors tapping on aluminum skin with rubber mallets. It wasn't chaos. It was music, industrial, relentless, precise. Every 30 minutes, a fuselage section advanced down the track. Every hour, a bomber was one step closer to flight. At the far end of the hall, the nose sections gleamed beneath skylights. They were identical, down to the last rivet, each stamped with the same serial number, prefix 42-6, an assembly mark so standardized that spare parts could fit any plane, any time. In another corner, workers tightened bolts in oxygen systems, following printed manuals that reduced engineering to repetition. A poster on the wall read, "Perfection is a process." The numbers defied imagination. Each B-29 required more than 150,000 individual parts, 200 sub-assemblies, and 2.6 million hours of labor. But here production wasn't measured in sweat. It was measured in rhythm. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, powered by a labor force of $30,000, many of them women who had never seen an airplane before the war. They worked in 3 shifts, sleeping in dormitories built beside the factory their children cared for, in nurseries paid for by Boeing. Across America, there were 4 other plants just like it in Marietta, Georgia, Renton, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, and Seattle, each specialized in a single section of the aircraft. Wings in Wichita, fuselages in Marietta, tail assemblies in Renton. When finished, the parts converged by rail in a ballet of logistics so exact that a complete bomber could roll out every 63 minutes. In Germany, the Me-262 jet fighter was still hand-assembled by craftsmen, 1 per week in underground tunnels lit by lanterns. In America, the B-29 was built by women listening to swing music. The contrast was almost cruel. The Reich's engineers had brilliance, but America had infrastructure. While Europe starved, the United States consumed more aluminum in a week than Germany did in a month. By 1944, America controlled 65% of the world's aluminum supply, 80% of its aviation fuel, and half of all machine tools on Earth. The scale was biblical. If war was an equation of logistics, the Americans had solved it. From an observation catwalk, Boeing's chief production officer, Ed Wells, watched the lines move like arteries. Below, workers in powder blue uniforms drilled rivets into a B-29 wing panel so large it required its own building. Each rivet was driven by air tools calibrated to the same torque across every plant in the country. Wells smiled. "Precision doesn't need geniuses," he said to a visiting general. "It needs systems that don't get tired." At the same hour, thousands of miles away in Manchuria, Hauptmann Miller sat at his desk, writing by lantern light. His pen scratched across the page. It would take Germany 10 years to reach their current speed of manufacturing, perhaps longer. He paused, staring at the reflection of his light in the aluminum scrap beside him. "They're building machines faster than we can count." Back in Kansas, a supervisor pinned a new chart on the wall. It showed production goals rising like the steps of a pyramid. The factory's motto stenciled above it read, "Wars are won by schedules." Each part of the process had been reduced to time and motion. Inspectors measured not only the accuracy of the work, but the rhythm of the workers themselves. Conveyor belts rolled at fixed intervals, radio operators synchronized clocks across plants to the second, and procurement officers calculated raw material deliveries by train car tonnage per hour. The entire machine of war had become self-aware. And yet, amidst all the machinery, there was something deeply human. The workers signed their initials on panels before they were sealed, scribbled messages inside bomb bay doors. "Good luck, boys, bring it home." They worked not with hatred, but with momentum. Production had replaced passion as the heart of warfare. In August 1944, Boeing Plant No. 1 completed its 500th B-29. A brass band played as factory doors opened and sunlight flooded the hangar. The bomber, silver and perfect, rolled out on its landing gear like a living monument to repetition. The workers cheered, their faces streaked with oil and pride. Cameras flashed. One reporter asked a welder what it felt like to build a weapon that could fly halfway across the world. She shrugged. "It feels like doing your part," she said. From the Midwest to the Pacific, the numbers climbed without end. 2,000 B-29s by year's end. 70,000 aircraft of all types rolling off American lines every year. In Berlin, Allied bombers dropped more tons of explosives in a month than Germany had dropped in the entire war. The Axis still fought, but the math was no longer in their favor. Miller saw the same truth in his own notes. "Even if we built one," he wrote, "we would need 1,000 more to matter." He looked at the blueprint spread before him, the one copied from the B-29's wing section. The lines were perfect, the ratios beautiful, but they meant nothing without the machinery to reproduce them. The realization came with the weight of prophecy. America didn't just build weapons. They built the means to build them forever. The war was not being won in the skies or seas, but in the hum of electric drills and the rhythm of shift changes. It was being won in factories where mistakes were counted in seconds, not deaths. At Boeing Wichita, another whistle blew. The night shift began. Thousands of lights blinked on, flooding the factory floor in white brilliance. The workers picked up where the last crew had stopped, as if the day had never ended. The conveyor belts rolled, the rivets hammered, and the future marched forward. If you believe the real battlefield of World War II wasn't Europe or the Pacific, but the American factory floor, comment 4. If you think victory still belonged to generals, not engineers, press like. And subscribe, because what happened next, when the Axis tried to copy the Superfortress, would prove just how far behind they really were. By September 1944, the wreck of the B-29 in Manchuria had been stripped to its bones. The crates of parts engine sections, of wing fragments, of instruments were loaded onto trains bound for Tokyo under orders stamped top secret. The Japanese military called it Project Koken-Ki, an attempt to reproduce the American giant. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's Technical Bureau received copies of the drawings through the diplomatic pouch. What had begun as curiosity had turned into obsession. At the Nakajima Aircraft Works outside Tokyo, engineers gathered around the crates as if they contained sacred relics. They laid the parts out on long tables and began to trace every bolt, every panel line. The logic was simple. If America could build such a bomber, Japan would build its twin. But the logic broke down the moment the first wrench turned. The alloy wouldn't cut properly. The dies for shaping the ribs cracked after the second press. The rivets seized under heat. The Japanese machinists worked with tools built for fabric-covered fighters, not for aircraft that weighed 60 tons. The B-29 skin required hydraulic presses capable of exerting thousands of tons of force machines that existed only in America's factories. The workers tried to improvise hammering the plates by hand, but the aluminum warped. What the Americans shaped in seconds, the Japanese couldn't reproduce in weeks. When the first report reached Berlin, it read like confession. Replication impossible, without equivalent industrial facilities. Miller read the memo by lamplight in Manchuria and felt the sentence settle into his bones. Replication impossible. The Reich had said the same thing years earlier about radar, about proximity fuses, about code machines. The Americans didn't invent faster, they manufactured faster. Germany had tried its own imitation months earlier. Juncker's engineers studying a captured B-17 had drafted plans for a long-range bomber they called the Ju-390. The project devoured resources, and the prototype barely lifted off before the program collapsed under shortages of fuel and alloy. Even if it had flown, it would have been one miracle against thousands. In 1944, miracles no longer mattered. In Japan, the Koken-Key project continued through the autumn. The engineers worked by candlelight as power shortages deepened. Each new test piece revealed another missing technology. The Americans used a heat-treating process that hardened the aluminum without warping it. Japan's furnaces couldn't maintain the temperature evenly. Their welding rods left bubbles that fractured under pressure. The B-29's flawless skin remained as unreachable as the sky it had flown in. One of the younger engineers wrote in his diary, "We have the shape, but not the soul." The same was true across the Reich. By late 1944, Allied bombers had reduced German aluminum output by 70%. Railroads were crippled factories scattered underground. Skilled workers were gone, drafted dead or displaced. The few remaining machines still ran, but there was no fuel to power them, no copper for wiring, no rubber for tires. Every B-29 that rolled off an American line now represented not just a plane, but an equation the Axis could no longer solve. Materials multiplied by time, multiplied by peace of mind. In Manchuria, Miller stood beside the crates of parts waiting for shipment westward. He picked up a section of tubing stamped with Boeing's logo and ran his thumb along its edge. Perfect. Not a burr, not a scratch. The Japanese colonel beside him asked, "How do they make so many so perfect?" Miller answered without looking up. "Because they built the world around them to make it possible." The colonel frowned. "We can copy their blueprints. You can copy a song," Miller replied, "but without the orchestra, it's only noise." By winter, the B-29 fragments that reached Berlin were already obsolete. The Americans had improved the design, streamlining the nose and replacing the engines with more reliable R-33 523s. The Luftwaffe's analysts, working in the ruins of Charlottenburg, reviewed the data and quietly shelved it. No report could hide the truth. The war's technology gap had become a chasm of civilization itself. Meanwhile, the real B-29s, alive and multiplying, filled the skies. From the Marianas, they flew missions thousands of kilometers across the Pacific. They burned oil refineries in Formosa airfields, in Shanghai factories, in Nagoya. The bomber that had fallen in Manchuria was already ancient history. The machine the Germans studied was not even the peak. It was a snapshot of a process still accelerating beyond their reach. Miller received another memo that winter, a request for his professional opinion. Can German industry produce an equivalent? He stared at the page before answering with one sentence, "Only if we can rebuild the planet." He closed his notebook. The war he'd believed in, the war of invention, of daring, of genius, was over. The new war was fought by schedules, logistics, and the math of abundance. America's greatest weapon wasn't ingenuity. It was inevitability. That spring, Allied bombers began pounding Tokyo with firestorms born from the same assembly lines that had produced the wreck in Manchuria. The irony was merciless. While Japan tried to replicate one fallen B-29, hundreds of its siblings were already erasing the very factories that attempted the copy. In the end, Project Kokenki never left the ground. The last surviving engineer wrote in his final report, "We built wings without air." If you believe a design can be stolen, but a system cannot comment. 5. If you think genius still outweighs mass production, press like. And subscribe, because what Miller would realize next in that frozen Manchurian hangar would change how he saw war itself and how humanity defines progress. Winter came early to Manchuria. The rice fields around Mukden froze into mirrors of gray ice, and the airfield that once smelled of fuel and humidity now reeked of rust and emptiness. Inside the hangar, the B-29's remains lay silent beneath a crust of frost. The tarpaulin stiffened like armor, the silver skin of the wreck catching the flicker of lantern light from a single desk in the corner. Hauptmann Erich Miller sat alone, coat draped over his shoulders, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Around him were the relics of a civilization he did not belong to, sections of aluminum ribs, sealed hydraulic lines, and fragments of instruments that no German factory could replicate. On the wall, pinned between maps and blueprints, hung a small metal plate stamped with a name he could not stop reading: Boeing, Wichita, Kansas. He had stared at it for hours. The word had begun to lose meaning, turning from a company name into a prophecy. Boeing was not a designer, not a man. It was an organism, alive and self-sustaining. Its pulse was the hum of machinery thousands of miles away. Its veins were the railways and shipyards of a continent untouched by war. Every rivet on the B-29's body was a cell in that creature's body, every bomber a breath. The machine had become its own species, and America its habitat. The Japanese guards avoided the hangar now. They called the wreck cursed, a monument to a power too vast to comprehend. Miller didn't argue. He found solace there, surrounded by silence and symmetry. He would trace his gloved fingers across the edges of the fuselage, the metal still cold but smooth, unyielding. Each touch felt like acknowledgement, a gesture of respect between two engineers separated by civilization. He opened his notebook, the one he had started months earlier when the wreck first arrived. Its pages were filled with drawings, measurements, and notes, written in a hand that had grown more hesitant with each entry. He read one line from early autumn. "This machine is not a bomber. It is a factory that flies." He smiled bitterly. Back then, the phrase had sounded clever. Now it felt like confession. Miller thought of the factories back home. He pictured the underground tunnels at Nordhausen, where slave laborers built rockets by torchlight. He remembered the rumors of aircraft assembled in caves of engineers, dying for lack of food, of production lines that collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. Germany's ingenuity had become its own cage. The Reich still believed it could invent its way out of ruin, but invention was not enough anymore, not against a nation that could mass-produce perfection without flinching. He rose from the desk and walked toward the wreck. The moonlight through the hangar roof painted the metal in pale blue streaks. He stopped at the cockpit. Its glass shattered, its instruments scattered, and peered inside. There in the twisted frame, he saw his reflection mingled with the bombers. He looked older than he remembered. "You were never our enemy," he whispered to the machine. "You were our replacement." He sat again, the wooden chair creaking beneath him, and wrote his final entry. His handwriting was steady now, as if the cold had burned away all hesitation. "We believed we were the masters of engineering. We believed genius could conquer time. But this is not genius. This is order. This is civilization made mechanical. The Americans have built a weapon that no bomb can destroy the system itself. We will lose not because they fight better, but because they manufacture the future while we still forge the past." He stopped, exhaled, and watched his breath fog in the air. The sound of distant engines echoed faintly beyond the hills. He recognized the tone instantly, 4 radial engines climbing through the thin night air. Another B-29 flying overhead. He listened until the hum faded into silence. For a brief foolish moment, he felt gratitude, not for victory or survival, but for witnessing what perfection looked like before it buried him. When dawn came, frost had crept across the hangar floor, turning every metal surface white. Miller stood by the wreck one last time, touching the edge of the wing where the American logo had once been painted. The paint had burned away, but beneath the soot, the letters B-29 Superfortress were still faintly visible. He ran his hand across them like a priest reading a scripture. "You were not built to kill," he murmured. "You were built to outlast." Outside, the Japanese guards prepared to abandon the site. Soviet forces were moving closer every week. Miller didn't bother to pack. The reports were already finished. The conclusions didn't need him anymore. The bomber had spoken louder than any scientist could. That night, as he prepared to leave, he looked one final time at the metal plate from the wreck Boeing, Wichita, and slipped it into his pocket. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He would carry it across continents, through defeat and captivity, through the fall of his empire and the birth of another age. Years later, when he stood in a rebuilt Berlin and watched the first jetliners cross the sky, he would recognize the same perfection in their shape. The future had come from Kansas, not from Berlin. He left the hangar without looking back. Behind him, the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, whistling softly against the aluminum skeleton, a sound halfway between a sigh and a hymn. If you believe that true defeat comes not from losing battles, but from realizing your enemy has already built the future, comment 6. If you think war is still won by courage alone, press like. And subscribe, because what follows next, the final lesson of this discovery, will show that the greatest weapon of all was not destruction, but prediction. By the time the war ended, the wreck in Manchuria had rusted into silence. Grass had grown through its broken wings, and the cold rain of the Asian plains washed away the fingerprints of every man who had studied it. The B-29 was no longer a weapon, no longer an enemy. It had become a fossil of the future. Across the ocean, the factories that had built it were still alive, humming without pause. Boeing, Wichita, Marietta, Renton, the same plants that had once forged bombers, now began turning out civilian airliners, cargo transports, and research prototypes. Where the Luftwaffe had left ruins, the Americans left assembly lines. Their war machine hadn't stopped when peace arrived. It had merely changed shape. In 1945, while Europe counted its dead, the United States produced more steel than the rest of the world combined. Its factories exported engines, trucks, and turbines by the thousands. A nation built to destroy had discovered that it could create faster than anyone could recover. The weapon had evolved into an economy. The numbers told the story no propaganda could. During the war, the United States built 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks. Its factories consumed half of the world's copper and 3/4 of its aviation fuel. In the same 4 years, Germany's industrial output had collapsed by 70%, Japan's by 90%. For every ton of steel the Axis produced, America made 20. For every bomb the Allies dropped, the Americans built a plane to carry 10 more. But the real victory wasn't measured in tonnage or sorties, it was measured in what survived. When peace came, the same blueprints that had birthed the B-29 became the foundation for a world rebuilt around abundance. Cargo planes became airliners. Military logistics became global trade. The systems that had once fed armies began feeding continents. Hauptmann Müller returned to Berlin in 1946 as a prisoner, thin, quiet, and carrying a small metal plate in his coat pocket. He never spoke of it to the guards, nor to the other engineers he met in captivity. But at night, he would take it out, rub the engraved letters with his thumb, and whisper the word as if it were an incantation Boeing. When he was released years later, he found a city that no longer needed miracles. Germany's factories were rubble, its railways torn apart, its engineers scattered. Yet even amid the ruins he saw something familiar, a reconstruction plan led, not by generals or visionaries, but by men with clipboard schedules and machines. America had not just won the war, it had taught the world how to build the future on time. He visited one of the new Marshall Plan factories rising on the outskirts of Munich. The building smelled of oil and hope. Conveyor belts ran like veins through the concrete skeleton. A young foreman explained that the equipment came from the United States standardized presses, interchangeable tools, electric hoists calibrated to identical torque settings. Miller ran his hand along a freshly machined wing spar and felt a chill of recognition. "They've exported the process," he murmured. "Even peace has become a product." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Boeing company unveiled its first post-war prototype, the Model 377 Stratocruiser, a civilian descendant of the B-29. Its pressurized cabin carried 100 passengers in comfort across oceans that had once been battlefields. Newspapers called it luxury at 30,000 feet. Miller saw the photographs in a European journal and smiled faintly. He recognized the same cockpit glass, the same curve of aluminum that had once terrified him in Manchuria. The machine had shed its bombs, but not its purpose to dominate the skies through production, not destruction. By 1950, the United States was producing half of all manufactured goods on Earth. The nation's factories had become temples of precision, their rituals unchanged since the war repetition substitution improvement. Every refrigerator, every car, every aircraft bore the genetic code of the B-29 modularity, efficiency, abundance. The bomber had not just won a war, it had defined an era. Historians later called it the arsenal of democracy. But Mueller knew better. Democracy had not built the arsenal. Industry had built democracy. The ability to make everything had become the right to choose anything. The same process that riveted wings now built futures. One autumn evening decades later, Miller stood at an air show outside Hanover. He was an old man now, his hair thin, his posture stooped. A silver jetliner roared overhead, its engines smooth and cold, its skin flawless. The announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Boeing 707, the future of flight." The old engineer smiled. "I've seen this before," he whispered, "only now it carries passengers instead of bombs." The crowd cheered as the jet disappeared into the clouds. Mueller reached into his coat pocket and felt the worn metal plate still there, edges dulled by time. Boeing, Wichita. It was no longer a name. It was a prophecy fulfilled. He closed his eyes and remembered the hangar in Manchuria, the frost on the wreck, the silence the way the sunlight had touched the polished wing. He realized that he had not studied a bomber at all. He had studied the future. The narrator's voice fades over a montage of archives assembly lines, women riveting aircraft men in hard hats, guiding steel girders, cities rising from ashes ships, leaving ports filled with goods instead of guns. The same rhythm that once forged war now powered civilization. Narration: Germany and Japan fought with courage. America fought with capacity. When their engineers touched the B-29, they weren't touching metal. They were touching the 20th century. The war ended, but the machine never stopped. It simply changed what it produced, no longer bombs, but the modern world itself. The camera lingers on an aerial shot of Wichita at dusk factories, glowing railways, weaving like veins of light the hum of turbines, fading into silence. If you believe that history's greatest victory wasn't won by generals, but by the hands of those who built what others only imagined, comment 7. If you think the future still belongs to the battlefield press, like. And subscribe, because some wars are not fought with weapons, but with the will to create what no one else can even dream of. April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above northern France, the sky was a perfect, merciless blue. The Luftwaffe pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 banked lazily through the thin air sunlight, flashing off the silver fuselages of their Focke-Wulf 190s. They were veterans aces of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia, men who had survived years of combat and who believed nothing could surprise them anymore. Then, far below, they saw them. 16 new American fighters were clawing their way upward engines, screaming in protest. The Germans watched with disbelief. The aircraft looked absurd, swollen, barrel-shaped fuselages with narrow wings and huge propellers. One pilot, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken, laughed into his oxygen mask. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," he radioed to his wingman. Laughter crackled across the radio net. To the men of JG-26, the new American machine seemed a joke, an overweight brute that had no place in the thin air of high-altitude combat. They had reason to be confident. The Luftwaffe's FW-190A5 was a masterpiece of engineering, sleek, fast, perfectly balanced. It could climb at over 300 to 400 feet per minute turn inside any opponent and dive with lethal precision. The Germans had fought Spitfires and P-40s and had come out on top again and again. And now, facing these ungainly American intruders, they felt the same invincibility that had carried them across Europe. Below them, the American formation rose steadily. 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group were beginning their first combat patrol over occupied France. To the men flying them, it felt like piloting a locomotive through the sky. Each aircraft weighed nearly 8 tons, fully loaded, twice as heavy as the German fighters circling above. The big Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engines roared like industrial furnaces, their propeller discs shimmering in the cold air. Inside those cockpits sat young men who had never seen combat before. Major Don Blakesley, the squadron leader, had transferred from the Royal Air Force, where he'd flown nimble Spitfires. He knew what his men did not yet understand, that the Thunderbolt was not a European-style dogfighter. It was a weapon built on a different philosophy: power over elegance, mass over maneuver, endurance over grace. The Americans were still learning how to fight with it. The Germans, watching from above, had no idea that this ungainly beast represented a new kind of war machine, one born not from perfection, but from production. The first radio reports from the German ground controllers were confident. Enemy fighters sighted climbing slowly near Caen. Orders went out to intercept and destroy. Oberleutnant Hermeken and his flight rolled over and dove. The sun flashed behind them, their engines howling as they plunged toward the Americans. The airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. From above, the P-47s looked like silver blimps moving in slow motion, heavy targets hanging in the sky. Hermeken's gun sight settled over the lead aircraft. He pressed the trigger and missed. The Thunderbolt pilot yanked his stick, the aircraft rolling with surprising speed. Hermeken overshot, pulling up hard to avoid collision. He blinked in disbelief. The milk bottle had turned faster than he expected. A second German came in from below, firing a burst of 20-millimeter cannon shells. The American pilot, Lieutenant Fred Christensen, saw the tracer streaks flash past his wingtip. He dove instinctively, the altimeter spinning as the heavy fighter dropped like a stone. Behind him, the German followed, confident that no aircraft that massive could recover from such a dive. But the Thunderbolt did. At nearly 500 miles per hour, the airflow screamed around the thick wings. The German pilot saw the American pull out just above the clouds and realized too late that he couldn't match the dive. The FW-190's controls stiffened. The nose refused to rise, and he broke off, shaken. For the first time that morning, the laughter stopped. The skirmish ended as quickly as it began. The Americans, inexperienced and outnumbered, disengaged and returned toward England. The Germans climbed back into formation, their leader calling for a status report. No losses, no victories, just confusion. Hermeken noted in his combat log, "The new American fighter is large and clumsy." Not a serious threat. It was the kind of note written by a man who believed his world would never change. But back at the German airfield, when the mechanics refueled and the pilots removed their oxygen masks, a few men spoke quietly about what they had seen. the strange American machine that could dive faster than anything else in the sky. The thick black smoke trails of its turbo-supercharger that still seemed to roar even as it vanished into the haze. It was a small unease, a thought quickly dismissed. Yet history would record that moment as the first time the Luftwaffe met the P-47 Thunderbolt and laughed. They would not laugh again. If you have ever seen someone mocked for being different, only to prove everyone wrong, type 1 in the comments below. Or tap, like if you believe that true power often hides in the most underestimated forms. And make sure to subscribe, because in part 2, we'll go beneath the armor to the monster's heart. Behind every machine that changes the course of history lies an idea no one believed could work. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt was born from such defiance. It was not designed in a moment of inspiration, but in a moment of panic. In June 1940, as German fighters swept across France and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies of Europe, the United States Army Air Corps sent an urgent request to Republic Aviation build a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching Germany's best. Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic, studied the specifications and laughed softly to himself. They wanted an aircraft that could climb to 35,000 feet, fight for hours, and carry enough firepower to tear through bomber formations, all using an engine that did not yet exist. What Kartveli designed instead would shock even the men who built it. It will be a dinosaur, he said to his engineers, but a dinosaur with good proportions. When the prototype XP-47B rolled out of the hangar in May 1941, it looked like nothing else on Earth. Almost 10,000 pounds of gleaming aluminum, twice the size of a Spitfire, powered by a massive 18-cylinder radial engine that seemed to fill the entire nose. Test pilots approached it like men walking toward a wild animal. Some doubted it could even lift off. But when the throttles opened, the earth itself seemed to shake. The engine's deep, thunderous growl earned the aircraft its future name long before anyone thought it deserved it, Thunderbolt. At the heart of this beast was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a mechanical symphony of 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect rings. Producing over 2,000 horsepower, it was the most powerful radial engine ever mounted on a single-engine fighter. Each cylinder was machined to microscopic tolerances, each piston balanced like the gears of a watch. Yet what made the R2800 truly revolutionary was what surrounded it, a labyrinth of ducts, turbines, and pipes that turned exhaust into power. The P-47's secret weapon was its turbo-supercharger, a device so advanced that even German engineers, when they later examined a captured aircraft, would struggle to understand it. Instead of mounting a simple mechanical compressor near the engine, the Americans had built an entire system stretching the length of the fuselage. Hot exhaust gases from the engine were routed through steel pipes to a turbine at the very rear of the aircraft, spinning at more than 20,000 revolutions per minute. That turbine drove a compressor that forced dense, cool air back into the engine, allowing it to breathe freely even at 30,000 feet, where German engines gasped for oxygen. The design was outrageous even by American standards. The ductwork alone weighed nearly 500 pounds. The added mass made the aircraft look obese, with its swollen belly and oversized propeller. But the payoff was staggering. At altitudes where Luftwaffe fighters lost half their power, the Thunderbolt's R2800 still roared at full strength. It could climb to 42,000 feet higher than any German interceptor and dive faster than the speed of sound's warning edge. Inside the thick wings waited another revelation. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, synchronized to converge their fire at 300 yards. Each weapon carried 425 rounds of ammunition, giving the Thunderbolt a total of 3,400 bullets, nearly 900 pounds of metal and propellant. A single 1-second burst unleashed over 100 heavy slugs, traveling at 2,100 feet per second. At that range, armor plate melted, wings disintegrated, and entire aircraft vanished in sprays of molten aluminum. The Germans relied on 20mm cannons, fewer in number, slower in rate of fire, and often prone to jamming. The Americans chose another path, relentless volume. The P-47 was not a duelist's rapier, it was a battering ram built to survive and overwhelm. But brute force required more than imagination. It demanded an industrial ecosystem capable of feeding it. Each R-2800 engine contained more than 2,400 parts. The control cables alone stretched 8 miles. Every bolt, rivet, and gear had to fit with microscopic precision. To produce one Thunderbolt, Republic Aviation coordinated over 300 subcontractors spread across the United States, from aluminum foundries in Pittsburgh to turbine plants in Connecticut. At the height of production, Republic's factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, operated 24 hours a day. Women who had never seen an aircraft before the war stood on the assembly lines with rivet guns and wrenches, turning raw metal into weapons of legend. They called themselves Thunderbolt Girls, and their work turned the impossible into the routine. By 1944, a new P-47 rolled out of the hangar every 60 minutes. Engineers from Germany who prided themselves on precision craftsmanship would later be stunned to learn that these machines, built by the thousands, often by untrained workers, performed as flawlessly as hand-assembled prototypes. It was the triumph of standardization, the philosophy that a machine's strength lay not just in its design, but in its ability to be replicated endlessly. The P-47 was a statement carved in steel. Quantity is a quality of its own. Its armor plates were thicker than any other Allied fighter. Its cockpit was wrapped in a steel bathtub, protecting the pilot from small arms fire and shrapnel. Even the canopy glass was bulletproof, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a 20mm shell. The landing gear could absorb the force of a 9-ton impact, allowing rough landings on improvised airfields. Every component seemed to shout the same message: survive, strike back, and keep flying. To pilots accustomed to the elegance of Spitfires or the agility of Mustangs, the P-47 felt monstrous. It was loud, heavy, stubborn, and brutally powerful. Yet those who mastered it discovered a paradox beneath its size was balance. Once in motion, it handled with surprising grace, rolling smoothly through high-speed dives and climbing like an elevator on fire. Its weight, once seen as a flaw, became its greatest weapon. In a dive, gravity itself became an ally. When German engineers finally examined a captured P-47 at a Luftwaffe airfield in 1943, they were silent for several minutes. The workmanship was crude compared to their standards, but the complexity was beyond anything they could mass produce. One officer reportedly said, "They build aircraft the way we build watches, only thousands of times larger." Another murmured, "We can't copy this, not with our factories." What they didn't understand yet was that the Thunderbolt was not a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a philosophy made metal, a combination of industrial audacity, mechanical excess, and sheer durability that could only have been conceived in a nation where machines were built faster than ideas could die. By the time the first P-47 squadrons arrived in England in early 1943, they were met with skepticism even from their allies. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was to unstrap and run around inside its roomy cockpit. But within months that laughter would vanish. The monster was about to show what its heart could do when unleashed. If you believe that true innovation begins when someone dares to ignore what's possible, type 2 in the comments below. Or tap like if you think perfection doesn't come from elegance, but from endurance. And subscribe, because in Part 3, the monster meets fire for the first time. By May 1943, the laughter in the German mess halls still echoed, but it carried a nervous edge. The new American fighter had arrived in growing numbers over northern France. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name the Germans first mocked and later feared. For now, it was just another target. The Luftwaffe had been hunting Allied fighters since 1939, and the Americans, with their shiny new machines and their rookie pilots, seemed no different. On May 4, 1943, the first large-scale encounter between P-47s and Focke-Wulf 190s unfolded over the English Channel. The Americans were escorting a formation of bombers returning from a raid on Lille. The sky was littered with contrails stretching from horizon to horizon, ribbons of white slicing through the upper atmosphere. Below, the Luftwaffe climbed to intercept. The battle began the way most air combats of that era began, with surprise. The German fighters attacked from below, diving upward in sharp bursts of cannon fire, then rolling over to evade pursuit. The Thunderbolts struggled to respond. Heavy and untested, they lost altitude quickly when turning, and their massive airframes made them easy to spot. Lieutenant Fred Christensen later wrote, "It felt like flying an apartment building with wings. Every time I tried to climb, it groaned like an old ship." The first month of combat was brutal. 14 P-47s were lost in April and May, while the Americans claimed only 3 German kills. For every victory, there was a dozen aircraft damaged or destroyed. German radio intercepts gleefully reported that the flying milk bottles were easy prey. Luftwaffe intelligence sent a memo to Reichsmarshal Göring. Enemy aircraft of new type appears slow and clumsy. Our pilots describe it as heavy and vulnerable. But what the reports didn't mention was what happened to the Thunderbolts that didn't fall. Some came home with damage no aircraft should have survived. One returned to base with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun impacts in its fuselage. Another landed with one wing nearly sheared off the control cables, shot to ribbons. Mechanics expected to find wreckage. Instead, they found the engines still running, the pilots pale, but alive. That was when the Americans began to realize that they were flying something different. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, understood the statistics better than anyone. For every pilot who crashed, another came back in an aircraft that should have disintegrated in mid-air. "I've never seen anything take punishment like this thing," Zemke told his men. "You can shoot it, you can set it on fire, you can tear half of it apart, it'll still bring you home." The Germans noticed it too. Pilots began reporting that their cannon shells seemed to vanish into the Thunderbolt's thick fuselage. Unlike the liquid-cooled Messerschmitts or the streamlined FW-190s, the P-47's massive radial engine had no vulnerable cooling system to puncture. You could blow off a cylinder or two, and it would keep running. The cockpit armor was thick enough to shrug off 20mm shrapnel. One Luftwaffe ace complained that his guns only made scratches on the American planes before he ran out of ammunition. For the American pilots, however, survival was small comfort. They were dying in unfamiliar skies, learning painful lessons in every encounter. The Luftwaffe still held the initiative. German formations used the sun as a weapon, diving from above in coordinated attacks, while the Thunderbolts climbed clumsily to respond. Many new pilots never even saw the enemy that killed them. But each loss taught something. American engineers studied every damaged aircraft that limped home, recording impact points, armor failures, and mechanical stresses. They realized the Thunderbolt's strengths lay not in turning fights, but in energy, in the raw power of its engine, and the speed of its dives. Zemke began teaching his men a new kind of aerial combat, boom and zoom. Climb high, dive like a hammer strike once and climb back out. Never turn with a German. Let gravity and horsepower do the work. By the summer of 1943, the P-47 was beginning to find its identity. On June 13th, a formation of Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group encountered a squadron of FW-190s near the French coast. The Germans attacked head-on, confident as always. But this time, the Americans didn't try to turn. They dove. 8 P-47s dropped from 30,000 feet like meteors, their engines howling as they hit 550 miles per hour, faster than any German pilot had ever seen a propeller-driven aircraft move. The lead Thunderbolt opened fire from 400 yards. the air filled with tracers, a storm of fire converging on a single point. The first FW-190 vanished in an orange explosion. The pilot never had time to react. The Germans broke formation, scattering, but the Thunderbolts were already climbing back to altitude, leaving chaos in their wake. It was a new kind of war in the air, one defined not by elegance or maneuver, but by energy and overwhelming firepower. The Luftwaffe began calling them Thunderers, Donnerflugzeuge, the aircraft that struck like lightning and disappeared into the clouds. Reports describe them as nearly invulnerable. They do not burn, one German officer wrote. They dive faster than any machine we possess. Even when hit, they continue to fight. Back in England, the American pilots were beginning to believe it too. They were learning that victory in the Thunderbolt was not about agility, it was about patience, altitude, and power. As one pilot joked, if they want to fight in the clouds, fine, we'll drop the clouds on them. By late June, the statistics had shifted. For every P-47 lost, the Luftwaffe was losing 2, sometimes 3. The Germans didn't understand how the balance had changed so quickly. They still thought they were fighting men. They hadn't yet realized they were fighting machines that refused to die. When the first photos of a Thunderbolt returning from a mission riddled with holes appeared in Allied newspapers, the caption read simply, "Still flying." To the world, it was just a headline. To the Luftwaffe, it was a warning. The monster they had mocked was learning how to fight. If you believe that endurance is a weapon as deadly as Firepower Type 3 in the comments below. Or tap like if you think true strength is not about never falling, but about always coming back. Subscribe now, because in Part 4, one man will take this machine to the edge of death and beyond the story of Robert S. Johnson and the unkillable plane. June 26, 1943, 26,000 feet over France. The sky was a burning white haze, the kind that made distance vanish and danger invisible. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron 56th Fighter Group was flying his P-47C half-pint at the rear of the formation, tired, sweating under his oxygen mask, and scanning the emptiness behind him. They were returning from escort duty over Lille, and the mission had been routine until it wasn't. Without warning, tracers tore through the formation. German fighters, 16 of them, dived out of the sun in perfect formation, Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26. They came down like falling knives. Johnson didn't even have time to shout a warning before his world exploded. The first burst hit him squarely. 20mm shells slammed into the fuselage, ripping through the engine, cowling, smashing the canopy, shredding the control panel. Shards of glass and metal sliced across his face. His oxygen mask filled with blood. A second volley hit, and the P-47 shuddered violently. Johnson tried to roll out, but his control stick barely responded. Then the fire alarm screamed. The engine compartment was burning. He reached for the canopy release to bail out, but it didn't move. A 20mm shell had exploded near the track, welding the frame shut. He pulled again, harder, blood running down his hands. Nothing. He was trapped. The P-47 was on fire, leaking fuel, and losing altitude fast. He thought about ramming the aircraft into the channel just to end it quickly. The cockpit temperature climbed. He could smell burning oil and cordite. But then the fire went out. The massive radial engine, still coughing and choking, had starved the flames of oxygen. Johnson blinked through the smoke. The propeller was still turning. Against every law of physics and mercy, the machine was still alive. He leveled off, steering west toward England. The controls were sluggish, half the instruments dead. He could barely see through the cracked canopy, his face slick with sweat and blood. Behind him, the sky was silent until it wasn't. A shape appeared in his rearview mirror, a single FW-190. The German pilot approached slowly, cautiously. He must have seen the damage and thought it would be an easy kill. Johnson didn't even have time to pray. The German opened fire. 20mm shells slammed into the wings, the fuselage, the tail. Johnson felt each impact through the seat like hammer blows. One shell burst against the armor plate behind his head. Another exploded against the windscreen, shattering it completely. He ducked instinctively as shards of plexiglass flew across his face. The roar of cannon fire filled the cockpit, punctuated by the metallic scream of ricochets. Still, the P-47 kept flying. The German broke off, circled, then came again. He fired another burst and another. Johnson's aircraft shuddered, smoke trailing behind it, pieces of metal fluttering off into the void. Then silence. The German was out of cannon rounds. Johnson thought it was over. He was wrong. The FW-190 pulled alongside almost wingtip to wingtip. Johnson could see the pilot's face, young blonde, calm. The German studied the crippled Thunderbolt for a few seconds, as if trying to understand why it was still airborne. Then he banked away, lined up again, and opened fire with his machine guns. Tracer fire ripped through the P-47's skin, smashing what little glass remained, punching holes across the wings. Johnson hunched behind the armor plate and waited for the end. But the end never came. After several long bursts, the German slowed, pulled alongside again, and looked into Johnson's eyes. The American pilot stared back, too shocked to feel fear anymore. The German shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, then raised one hand to his helmet in a small, almost respectful salute, and banked away. The FW-190 rolled over, disappeared into the clouds, and was gone. Johnson sat there breathing hard, surrounded by smoke, oil, and silence. The engine was barely running. His hydraulic system was gone. His left aileron hung by a single hinge. The elevator cables were half severed. 3 of the 4 main fuselage beams, the very bones of the airplane, were cracked. He had 21 cannon holes, 200 bullet strikes, and not a single control surface untouched. And yet somehow the aircraft obeyed his trembling hands. He crossed the channel at 8,000 feet, praying the engine would last another few minutes. As he approached the English coast, his radio crackled back to life. The voice of his controller came through. "Thunderbolt 61, identify. You're trailing smoke." Johnson keyed the mic. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "She's a little scratched up." He barely made the runway at Manston. The landing gear came down halfway uneven. The tires blew on impact. The aircraft skidded across the tarmac, sparks streaming from its belly before coming to a stop. When ground crews reached him, Johnson was unconscious, slumped over the stick. They pried open the canopy. It had to be cut apart with crowbars, and pulled him out. When the mechanics began counting bullet holes, they stopped at 200. Later that day, when his commander, Hub Zemke, saw the wreck, he simply stared in silence. "How did you bring this home?" he asked. Johnson, bandaged and pale, managed a faint smile. "She brought me home," he said. The engineers who examined the aircraft were stunned. The armor behind the cockpit had absorbed multiple direct hits. The radial engine, though riddled with shrapnel, still produced enough thrust to fly. Even with half its structure destroyed, the P-47 had remained controllable. They realized that what they were flying wasn't just a fighter, it was a fortress with wings. News of Johnson's survival spread quickly. The story ran in newspapers across America under the headline, "Pilot Returns from Hell." But within the 56th Fighter Group, it became legend. The men began calling their planes immortals. Pilots who had once cursed the Thunderbolt's size now blessed it. Every time they strapped in, they knew they were sitting inside a machine that refused to die. In Germany, intelligence officers received combat reports from the pilots of JG-26. One entry stood out: enemy aircraft took full cannon load and continued to fly. Pilot observed saluting before disengaging. Conclusion: new American fighter is over-engineered, but nearly indestructible. They weren't exaggerating. The Thunderbolt had rewritten the rules of survival. It was no longer about maneuverability or even tactics, it was about endurance. In a war of attrition, that was the deadliest weapon of all. Robert S. Johnson went on to score 27 victories before the war's end, becoming one of America's top aces. But he would always be remembered for that one flight when man and machine blood and metal defied everything that was supposed to be possible. He later said, "It wasn't courage that brought me home. It was the plane. I just held on and trusted her." If you believe that faith in yourself or in the tools you trust can keep you alive, even when the world falls apart, type immortal in the comments below. Or like this video, if you think this story proves that engineering and endurance can be one and the same. Subscribe now, because in Part 5 we'll see how that same machine turned the hunters into the hunted, the moment when the laughter of the Luftwaffe finally died. By the end of the summer of 1943, the laughter that once echoed through Luftwaffe radio channels had been replaced by something else: silence. A silence that fell whenever ground control announced incoming thunderbolts. A silence that spread through briefing rooms when the word Donnerflugzeug appeared on the operations board. The pilots who had once mocked the flying milk bottles were now painting them red on their maps, marking danger. Because by the autumn of that year, the P-47 Thunderbolt had transformed from an overweight curiosity into the most feared predator in the European sky. The transformation began with one simple realization: the Thunderbolt didn't need to fight like a fighter. It needed to fight like itself. Colonel Hubert Hoob Zemke and his men at the 56th Fighter Group had rewritten the playbook. No turning fights, no dogfighting gymnastics. Instead, they would use what the Germans couldn't match: speed, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. Boom and zoom, they called it. Climb to 30,000 feet, wait for the enemy to appear below, then dive like gravity's hammer, unleash hell, and climb away before anyone could respond. The strategy was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. On August 17, 1943, two massive formations of American bombers flew toward the German heartland. The twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg would mark the deepest penetration into Germany attempted up to that point. The Luftwaffe scrambled hundreds of fighters to intercept them: Bf-109s, Fw-190s, and twin-engine Bf-110 destroyers armed with cannons and rockets. Waiting above them were the Thunderbolts of the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups. From 30,000 feet, the sky looked like a slow-motion storm. The bombers were tiny silver dots below the contrails, twisting like smoke from burning cities. Then the P-47s rolled inverted and began their dives. At that altitude, gravity was no longer a force, it was a weapon. Lieutenant David Schilling led his section into the attack, the airspeed indicator screaming past 500 miles per hour. The Thunderbolt's wings shuddered, its propeller tips breaking the edge of supersonic flow. Below, a formation of Messerschmitt 110s lined up to fire their rockets into the bombers. Schilling's voice crackled over the radio tally-ho: "Dive in." 8 Thunderbolts hit the formation from above. The first burst of 50 caliber fire turned the lead German fighter into a ball of flame. The others broke formation instinctively, but it was already too late. Each Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns, each gun firing 13 rounds per second. In 2 seconds, a single Thunderbolt poured 200 heavy bullets into a target zone no wider than a truck. At convergence distance 300 yards, the firepower was unimaginable. One pilot later said it wasn't shooting, it was erasing. Witnesses described the sky as filled with tracer lines, a web of red and white streaks crossing through the air. When the bursts connected, German aircraft didn't fall, they disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselages, engines tore loose. Aluminum and oil ignited in a spray of molten metal. Within 60 seconds, 10 German aircraft were gone, not shot down, gone. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it. Their cannons, while deadly in short bursts, were slow to reload and carried limited ammunition. The Thunderbolt's Brownings, by contrast, could sustain continuous fire for 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. American pilots learned to control the bursts, tapping the trigger just long enough to flood their target with metal. The combined roar of 8 synchronized machine guns earned the weapon a new name among German pilots: Roosevelt's piano. The sound meant death. What terrified them even more was that they couldn't kill it. Time after time, reports came in of thunderbolts that absorbed entire cannon loads and returned home. "Our guns are useless," one German pilot wrote, after surviving an encounter near Lille. "They keep coming even on fire. You hit them again and again, and they only dive faster." The Thunderbolt's durability gave its pilots confidence, bordering on madness. They attacked from any angle through flak bursts and tracer walls, trusting that their armor would hold. They flew through explosions that would have shredded lighter aircraft. "If I could see the target," one pilot said, "I could hit it, and if I could hit it, it would die." By early 1944, the numbers told the story. In 6 months, the Thunderbolt units had destroyed more than 2,000 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. But statistics only hinted at what was happening inside the minds of the Luftwaffe's pilots. The boom and zoom attacks left them helpless. There was no defense against something that could appear from the stratosphere, strike with blinding speed, and vanish before you could react. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a veteran of over 200 missions, described his first encounter with the new P-47D model. In his diary, "They came from the sun, roaring like thunder. We turned into them expecting our usual advantage, but they climbed with us. Schmidt's plane was hit and exploded in mid-air. The Americans didn't fight us anymore. They crushed us." The new variant, fitted with a massive 13-foot Hamilton standard propeller, could climb like a rocket. The Germans had lost their last advantage. Now even at altitude, they were prey. The P-47's arrival changed more than tactics, it changed morale. Luftwaffe pilots began to refuse missions when Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Ground crews listened for that deep rolling engine note and felt dread settle in their stomachs. Wehrmacht soldiers on the ground developed a new phrase: "Thunder comes from clear skies." It wasn't metaphorical, it was survival instinct. And the Thunderbolt's power didn't stop in the air. It became a terror to everything that moved on the ground. Its 8 heavy guns shredded convoys, locomotives, and tanks. One 2-second burst could destroy a column of trucks or rip apart a locomotive boiler. When bombs and rockets were added to its arsenal in 1944, the P-47 became a flying artillery piece, erasing bridges and supply lines across occupied Europe. The German infantry began calling them Jabos fighter bombers, but whispered the name with fear. They said you could hear a thunderbolt before you saw it, that the sound alone froze men in place. Veterans later recalled that the roar of 8 Brownings firing together was unlike anything else, a mechanical scream that seemed to vibrate the very air. In Berlin, Luftwaffe Command issued new directives, warning pilots to avoid head-on engagements with P-47s. The reason was printed in cold bureaucratic language: probability of surviving return fire minimal. By late 1944, the joke was dead. The laughter had stopped. Even Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter arm, admitted to his staff, "We underestimated them completely. They have power we cannot match. They build them faster than we can count our dead." In less than a year, the Thunderbolt had achieved what no one thought possible. It had silenced the Luftwaffe's arrogance. The hunter had become the hunted. If you believe that overwhelming force, guided by purpose, can end even the loudest arrogance, type 5 in the comments below. Or like this video if you think the sound of those 8 Brownings marked the exact moment when laughter turned to fear. Subscribe now, because in Part 6, we'll step beyond the battlefield and into the factories where America's true weapon was built, not from steel, but from scale. By the beginning of 1944, even the most devoted German optimists understood that the war in the air was no longer a contest of skill. It was a contest of production. Every time the Luftwaffe shot down a Thunderbolt, another 5 appeared within weeks. Every pilot lost to attrition was replaced by 3 more trained men from an American airfield somewhere in the Midwest. The industrial tide had turned, and it was rising faster than anyone on the Axis side could comprehend. In January, the Allied intelligence section of the Luftwaffe compiled a classified report titled American Aircraft Industry, Monthly Output. The numbers were incomprehensible. The United States had produced more than 85,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. Republic Aviation's P-47 accounted for nearly 30% of all American single-engine fighters built that year. The Germans checked their math 3 times, convinced there was an error. There wasn't. To understand the scale of what was happening, one had to see it. In the Republic factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, daylight never disappeared. Massive floodlights burned through the night, illuminating a sea of metal and motion. Thousands of workers, men too old for combat, women too young to vote, moved in synchronized rhythm, riveting, welding, and testing. Conveyor belts carried fuselages down endless rows of machinery. Each hour, another Thunderbolt rolled out of the hangar doors and onto the rail cars waiting outside. It took 28 days to build a fighter at the start of the war. By mid-1944, it took less than 1. Inside those walls, the heart of the Thunderbolt beat endlessly, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. More than 125,000 of those engines would be built before the war ended. They were produced not only by Pratt & Whitney, but by Ford, Chevrolet, and Buick companies that once made sedans, now forged the veins and pistons of war. Every time a new engine was completed, a brass plate was riveted onto its casing, built for victory. The German engineers who later examined captured Thunderbolts were astonished by what they saw. Each component bore a serial number linked to a master catalog. That meant that a replacement part built in Detroit would fit perfectly into an airframe assembled in New York. It was engineering as replication, not artistry. Germany's factories still relied on handcrafting and fine calibration. America's relied on interchangeable parts, on a philosophy that perfection wasn't a single masterpiece, but the ability to reproduce one endlessly. In a Luftwaffe briefing at Rechlin, a senior engineer slammed a copy of the American production report onto the table and shouted, "We are trying to carve sculptures while they pour concrete." The metaphor was apt. The Thunderbolt symbolized this industrial avalanche. It wasn't just a machine, it was the visible face of an entire ecosystem of production. Aluminum for its wings came from Alcoa smelters in Tennessee. Rubber for its tires came from Louisiana. Gun barrels were forged in Ohio, ammunition belts assembled in Illinois, propellers machined in Connecticut. Every state fed the beast. Each month, hundreds of freight trains loaded with parts crossed the continent, like veins pumping steel and fuel through a living organism called America. By comparison, the Reich's industrial base was collapsing. Allied bombers shattered assembly plants faster than they could be repaired. Skilled labor was drafted into the army or replaced by prisoners. Material shortages forced engineers to substitute wood for metal to weld where once they riveted. Aircraft left German factories lighter, weaker, and fewer. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, quantity was breeding quality. The Americans learned faster because they could afford to make mistakes. They could lose 100 aircraft testing new engines and simply build another 100 better ones. Every new production run was an iteration. Every pilot's report became data. Every loss was absorbed and transformed into improvement. By mid-1944, the Republic P-47 had evolved into the D model, the most powerful variant of the war. It carried more fuel, more ammunition, and more ordnance than any single-engine fighter in history. Each one cost roughly $85,000 to build, the price of a modest house in the United States, and America was building them at a rate of 600 per month. The Luftwaffe had no answer. Their total fighter output across all models hovered around 300 to 400 aircraft per month, constantly disrupted by bombing raids and fuel shortages. Even if every German fighter shot down 2 Thunderbolts, the arithmetic of defeat remained unchanged. It was no longer a question of tactics or heroism. It was mathematics. The Germans realized this most painfully during the battles over France in 1944. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, waves of P-47s swept across the French countryside, destroying trains, bridges, and convoys. The Luftwaffe scrambled what it could, but for every squadron launched 10 thunderbolts, weighted above the clouds. The Germans called them steel locusts. Oberst Werner Mulder's replacement, a weary colonel named Karl-Heinz Graeme, wrote bitterly in his field diary, "We no longer fight airmen, we fight their factories." He wasn't wrong. The war had shifted from the battlefield to the production line. Each rivet driven in Detroit, each barrel forged in Buffalo, each bolt tightened in Farmingdale was another bullet fired at Germany's future. And because those workers were safe from bombing, well-fed, and supplied with endless raw materials, they could keep firing forever. By the end of 1944, more than 15,600 Thunderbolts had been produced. Their engines alone consumed more aluminum and copper than the entire Luftwaffe's yearly allowance. American fuel production reached 22 billion gallons a year, enough to power every Allied aircraft tank and truck with room to spare. Germany was down to synthetic gasoline made from coal, rationed by the leader. The P-47 had become the embodiment of that disparity. It was not the sleekness of its design or the genius of its pilot that made it unbeatable. It was the factory that never slept, the workers who never stopped, and the logistics network that reached across oceans. When German engineers captured a Thunderbolt intact and disassembled it for study, one of them reportedly whispered, "This isn't a plane, it's an economy." Back in Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold summarized the truth in one sentence: "The first bomb we dropped on Germany was built in a factory 10 years before the war began." For every man who flew a Thunderbolt, tens of thousands stood behind him: machine operators, riveters, train conductors, and engineers. None of them armed, all of them warriors. Together they turned production into a form of warfare. In late 1944, as the skies over Europe filled with endless silver formations, a German fighter commander radioed his base during a desperate dogfight. His voice was shaking. "They are everywhere," he said. How do you fight a country that manufactures the air itself? If you believe that true power comes not from the battlefield, but from the will to build Type 6 in the comments below. Or like this video, if you think industry, not ideology, decides the fate of nations. Subscribe now, because in Part 7, we'll leave the noise of the factories behind and return to the men who faced the truth, the moment when the Luftwaffe's laughter finally turned to respect. By the spring of 1945, the once blue skies of Europe had turned gray with exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany's war machine, was a shadow of its former self. Airfields that had once roared with takeoffs now stood silent, littered with the wreckage of aircraft that would never fly again. The men who had once ruled the air were gone, lost to attrition, captured, or simply too tired to fight. And among those who survived, one truth had taken root, whispered from cockpit to control room to command bunker: the Thunderbolt had ended the war long before the bombs reached Berlin. Adolf Galland, the elegant cigar-smoking commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, wrote later in his memoirs, "At first we laughed at the P-47. It looked like a monster. But it was a monster born from a civilization of machines, a monster we could never have created." Galland wasn't exaggerating. By the time his words were written, the P-47 had flown over 500,000 combat sorties, destroyed more than 3,700 enemy aircraft in the air, and annihilated tens of thousands of vehicles, trains, and tanks on the ground. It was the hammer that pounded every bridge, every rail line, every convoy that tried to move under the European sun. What had begun in 1943 as scattered skirmishes had become a storm of metal by 1945. Thunderbolts operated from dozens of airfields across France and Belgium, attacking everything that moved east of the Rhine. Entire German divisions were cut off, not by armies, but by the constant presence of that deep rolling sound above the rumble of the R-2800 engine, the thunder that meant death was coming from somewhere unseen. For the men on the ground, there was no escape. Wehrmacht soldiers learned to hide beneath trees, inside barns, even under their own vehicles, anything to shield them from the strafing runs. You didn't look up, one survivor recalled. Looking up meant you might see it, and if you saw it, you were already dead. In the final months, the P-47 became more than a fighter. It became the sky's executioner. Bridges over the Rhine fell under its bombs. Armored trains were ripped apart by its 8 Brownings. Even tanks, the symbol of German pride, became helpless targets. Pilots joked grimly that the Thunderbolt's guns could melt steel faster than a foundry. But inside those cockpits, the laughter was gone too. The young men who flew them knew what victory looked like, now burning convoys, endless smoke columns, the black scars of a continent being pounded into surrender. The Thunderbolt had become unstoppable, but it had also become weary. Each mission felt heavier, every victory quieter. In March 1945, as Allied forces crossed into Germany, a captured Luftwaffe engineer was shown the remains of a P-47 that had crash-landed near Cologne. The aircraft was riddled with holes, its wings twisted, its fuselage cracked, but the engine still sat intact. He knelt beside it, running his hand over the dented cowling. "We spent the war chasing perfection," he said quietly. "They spent it building infinity." That sentence, more than any statistic, explained the end of the Luftwaffe. For years, German engineers had built machines that represented their ideals: precise, elegant, technically brilliant. The Americans built machines that represented something else entirely: scale reliability and the ability to outlast chaos. Every Thunderbolt was a statement that the war would not be won by genius, but by endurance. Every replacement aircraft, every interchangeable part, every pilot stepping into a cockpit proved that the United States had turned war into an equation, and Germany was on the wrong side of the math. In April, as the Reich collapsed, a small group of German officers gathered at an airfield outside Munich. Among them was Joseph Pips Priller, one of Germany's most celebrated aces. He had shot down 101 Allied aircraft, survived hundreds of missions, and seen the best pilots of his generation vanish one by one. Watching an American formation thunder overhead, he turned to a younger officer and said quietly, "Once we owned the sky. Now it belongs to factories." The officer nodded. Neither spoke again. That was the reckoning, the moment when pride became respect. The men who had once mocked the flying milk bottle now studied it in silence, recognizing in its bulk and brutality the embodiment of a nation's will. The P-47 was not beautiful. It was not elegant, but it was honest. It was the physical proof that determination, not design, had decided the fate of Europe. When the war ended, captured, German technicians were brought to Allied facilities to assist in evaluating their aircraft. Among them was a veteran engineer named Hans Müller, who had once examined a downed P-47 back in 1943. Standing beside a hangar in France 2 years later, he saw a row of Thunderbolts parked in the sun, their olive-green paint chipped, their noses streaked with oil. He turned to an American officer and said, "When we first saw this machine, we thought it was crude. Now I think it was perfect. It survived the war. We did not." It was not a confession of defeat. It was an acknowledgement of truth. By 1945, the United States had produced 15,683 Thunderbolts. The Luftwaffe had built a total of roughly 33,000 Adler fighters across all models. The numbers alone told the story. But behind those numbers were people: the mechanics, the riveters, the factory workers who had never fired a weapon yet had contributed more to victory than any general. The P-47 was their signature. It carried the fingerprints of a million hands, the roar of a nation's industry, and the endurance of a civilization that refused to lose. It was the sound of mass and momentum of steel turned into survival. After the war, Robert S. Johnson, scarred, older, and decorated, was invited to visit one of the old Republic factories. When he walked through the assembly lines, now silent and empty, he placed his hand on the smooth aluminum skin of a P-47D that had never flown. "She was more than a plane," he said quietly. "She was America." That sentiment echoed in every after-action report, every factory photograph, every ruined German airfield. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had redefined what victory meant. It was proof that in the modern world courage was no longer measured in the hearts of soldiers, but in the heartbeat of machines that carried them home. Galland, in his final interview before his death in 1996, was asked which Allied aircraft he respected most. He paused for a long moment before answering. "The P-47, he said, because it should never have worked. And yet, it won the war." That is the legacy of the Thunderbolt, a machine so overbuilt, so heavy, so improbable, that it embodied not the genius of an engineer, but the determination of a people. A fighter born from industry, perfected by necessity, and remembered not for its beauty, but for its survival. If you believe that respect is the final form of victory, type 7 in the comments below. Or like this video, if you think the true monument to courage is not marble or metals, but the steel that endures after everything else has fallen. Subscribe to stay with us for the next series, where we explore the unseen stories of the machines and the men that built the modern world from the ashes of war.